They thought she was just another black woman in a hoodie. Invisible, powerless, easy to humiliate, easy to forget. But what they didn't know was that Naomi Carter was more than she seemed, much more. When she walked through the courthouse doors that morning, she wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't there to make a scene. She just wanted to do her job with dignity, with grace. But the badge on her chest wasn't enough. The calm in her voice wasn't enough. The years of service, the years of sacrifice, none of it mattered to them. All they saw was a black woman they could control, a black story they thought would end in silence. They thought wrong, because when the clippers buzzed, stripping her dignity strand by strand, they didn't just scar her scalp, they awakened something they couldn't crush: dignity, fury, silent, unstoppable power. And when Naomi Carter put on that judge's robe, everything in that courtroom, every whisper, every smirk, every ounce of cruelty came crashing down. This isn't just a story about humiliation. It's a story about resistance, about grace under fire, about the quiet storms that change everything. Because behind every hoodie, behind every moment of cruelty, there's a black story waiting to rise. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The Louisiana morning pressed heavy against Naomi Carter's skin as she stepped out of her old Ford Fusion. Humidity clung to everything like an invisible weight, thick and smothering. She paused for a moment by the curb, feeling the sun rising slow behind her, washing the courthouse steps in a harsh golden light, adjusting the worn leather strap of her satchel across her shoulder. Naomi squared her stance and started up the marble stairs. Her loafers made soft, steady clicks against the stone, each step a quiet declaration. She belonged here. Even if they did not see it, she had never been one for dramatics, no flashy entrance, no parade of importance. Naomi believed in blending in, observing quietly from the shadows until it was time to speak. It was a skill sharpened from years of survival, years of knowing that sometimes invisibility was armor. She wore simple clothes, gray slacks pressed crisp, a navy blouse buttoned to the collar, her natural curls tucked neatly under a dark scarf. No robe, never the robe outside court. The badge tucked inside her blazer was real, federal, heavy with authority earned through blood, sweat, and endless nights. But badges could only do so much when the world decided you were invisible. As Naomi neared the entrance, she felt it, the shift, the subtle stiffening of postures behind the glass security booths. The way conversations died into murmurs as her presence brushed against the invisible line drawn across the marble floor. It was not fear. It was something uglier. Suspicion. The courthouse was an old building, proud and crumbling, full of stories soaked into its bones. Stories that said people like her did not belong in places of power. Stories that clung to the walls like mold no one wanted to admit was there. Naomi knew better than to react. She kept her expression even, her steps measured, head up, eyes forward. At the security checkpoint, the barrier became flesh. Officer Travis Monroe stood planted like a rusted gatepost, broad-shouldered, beer-bellied, skin weathered to the color of old newspaper. His uniform fit too tight across his chest, his belt sagging under the weight of authority he had not earned, only inherited. His eyes narrowed the moment he saw her. He did not see the calm in her walk. He did not see the intelligence burning quietly behind her gaze. He did not see the badge tucked inside her jacket. He saw a threat. He saw a hoodie where there was none. And for him, that was enough. Without a word, he stepped forward, holding out a thick hand wrapped in a latex glove. "Step aside, ma'am," he said. The word ma'am twisted in his mouth like something sour. Naomi stopped. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her satchel, not in fear, in calculation. She had been here before. Not this building, not this exact moment, but this feeling. this sharp edge in the air, this cold, familiar knowledge that no matter how quietly you walked, someone would always find a way to call you too loud. She forced herself to smile politely. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice smooth as Riverstone. Monroe did not answer right away. Instead, his gaze swept over her, slow, measuring, dissecting. From the simple flats on her feet to the scarf tied carefully at her crown, a black woman, alone, unmarked by rank in his eyes, and in his world, that meant suspect. He gave a grunt of annoyance, jerking his chin toward the side hallway. "Random check," he muttered. "Standard procedure." It was a lie. They both knew it. But lies carried weight when spoken by a man with a badge and a baton. Naomi hesitated only for a fraction of a second. Because hesitation, too, could be used against you. With a practiced hand, she reached inside her blazer and produced her ID. The badge glinted briefly under the fluorescent lights. Federal judge, clearance level, top tier. She held it out for him to see. For the record, for the truth. But Monroe barely glanced at it. He took the ID between two fingers like it was something unclean. Then he slipped it into his pocket without a second thought. Naomi's heart gave a small, cold thud. "I will need that back," she said calmly. Monroe's lip curled into a sneer. "You in a hurry?" "Sweetheart," he said. Sweetheart again. A word meant to belittle, to shrink her. The young woman operating the X-ray belt glanced over, her face tightening. She knew, but she said nothing. Silence stacked on top of silence. Naomi said nothing more. She simply lifted her chin a fraction higher. "I need to get to courtroom 3, she said. Monroe grunted. "You will. After we finish our check?" He reached out, his hand clamping down on her upper arm. It was not violent, but it was a claim, a declaration that here, in this place, her word meant nothing. And with that, they led her away from the crowd, down a side corridor where shadows pooled thick and heavy against the walls. The hallway smelled of cold tile and old dust, the kind of forgotten place where things happened unseen, where power twisted quiet into compliance. Naomi Carter walked willingly, because she knew sometimes the only way to defeat a monster was to let it believe you were still asleep. The door to the secondary screening room swung shut behind Naomi with a dull, final thud. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting the small, windowless space in a sickly, white glare. A steel chair sat bolted to the center of the floor. Beside it, a small cart cluttered with plastic gloves, wands, and an old pair of electric clippers, the kind used in barbershops and county jails alike. Naomi kept her breathing even. The clippers on the table were not part of any standard security screening. She knew that. They knew that. But Monroe stood there anyway, arms crossed, a smug tilt to his stance, daring her to question him. Behind him, another officer entered the room, a younger man, mid-20s maybe, his face too pale and his eyes darting nervously between Naomi and Monroe. He did not seem cruel, just weak. The kind who went along with the pack because it was easier than standing alone. Monroe gestured to the chair. "Sit down," he barked. Naomi did not move. "I do not consent to this search," she said, her voice clear, steady. "You have no legal cause to detain me." Monroe smirked. "You are acting suspicious. That is cause enough," he said, his hand resting casually on the clippers. The younger officer shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing at the mirror mounted high on the wall, a mirror Naomi knew concealed a recording camera, a camera that, right now, would conveniently be turned off, because accountability was never invited to rooms like this. Naomi inhaled slowly. She could resist. She could demand a supervisor. She could make noise. But noise was what they wanted. Noise would justify force. Noise would stain her record. Noise would be twisted into a narrative about an angry black woman threatening security, so she stayed still, silent, waiting. Monroe grunted in amusement at her lack of reaction. "You think that badge you flashed means something," he said, stepping closer. "Not here, not to me." The words hit harder than if he had shouted. This was not about security. It was about power. About reminding her that no matter how high she climbed, someone would always try to pull her back down into the dirt. Monroe picked up the clippers. The machine whined to life with a sharp, electric buzz. Naomi's stomach twisted once a small, involuntary reaction, but her face remained calm. "You could be hiding something in that mop," Monroe said, gesturing to the scarf tied neatly around her curls. Standard procedure. It was not. They both knew it. Still, he moved closer, clippers raised. Naomi stood rooted in place. She would not sit. She would not kneel. If they wanted to strip her dignity, they would have to do it standing. The younger officer stepped forward hesitantly, glancing once more toward Monroe for reassurance before reaching for Naomi's arm. His fingers brushed against her wrist. Tentative. "Just cooperate, ma'am," he mumbled. But Naomi knew better. Cooperation was not what they wanted. Submission was. She looked the younger man in the eye, not with anger, not with fear, but with a cold, piercing stillness that made him flinch and step back. For a brief second, the room teetered on a knife's edge. Monroe sneered, frustrated by her refusal to tremble. "Hold her," he snapped. The young officer obeyed, his grip firmer this time. Naomi allowed herself to be held. She did not resist. She refused to give them the satisfaction. The clippers pressed against her scalp. A low, sickening vibration rattled through her skull as the first chunk of silver hair sheared away, falling heavy onto the tiled floor. Another swipe. Another. The scarf fell loose, dropping alongside strands of hair, symbols of a history, a pride, a resilience they would never understand. Naomi closed her eyes, not in weakness, but in reverence, for every ancestor who had stood tall when stripped bare, for every voice that had been silenced and still echoed through the bones of this land. She would not scream. She would not beg. She would endure. When it was done, Monroe stepped back, wiping loose hairs from his sleeves with a satisfied grunt. "Now you look more presentable," he said with a crooked grin. The young officer would not meet her gaze. Naomi opened her eyes and stared straight at Monroe. Her face was calm. Her spine was straight. And when she spoke, her voice was as cold and sharp as steel. "You will regret this." Monroe leaned in, breathing beer and arrogance. "People like you always say that," he said. But Naomi did not flinch, because the truth was not in the shouting. The truth was in the silence, and her silence had become a loaded weapon. Without another word, Monroe opened the door and motioned lazily toward the hallway. "You are free to go," he said mockingly. "Third floor is that way." Naomi moved slowly, deliberately. She retrieved her badge from Monroe's desk, plucking it from beneath a pile of half-eaten fast food wrappers without asking for permission, and tucked it back into her blazer. Each movement was controlled, precise, a reminder that even when stripped bare, she remained unbroken. As she stepped back into the hallway, the buzz of the courthouse resumed low, nervous, fragmented, but Naomi heard none of it. All she heard was the blood pounding, steady and strong in her ears, because the game had just changed, and they had no idea how badly they had already lost. The hallway swallowed Naomi whole behind her. The small security room remained a tomb for dignity stripped away ahead of her. The sprawling marble floors of the courthouse stretched long and empty, every step a slow battle against the tightness coiling in her chest. She would not stop. She would not falter. Naomi's hand brushed lightly over her scalp, feeling the uneven tufts left behind, the strands of silver, once a crown of hard-earned wisdom, now gone, but hair was only hair. Dignity lived deeper. It pulsed in her bones. It burned behind her eyes. And today, it would roar without ever raising its voice, clutching her satchel tighter against her side. Naomi moved toward the grand staircase leading to the third floor. Each step was heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the cold, controlled fury building beneath her ribs. She passed by clerks and interns who pretended not to see her, lawyers in polished shoes who turned their faces to the walls, court officers who shuffled their papers a little louder as she walked by. They had seen, some of them had heard, but none of them had spoken. Silence layered over silence until it became a fortress too thick for truth to penetrate. Naomi did not blame them. Fear was a powerful thing, and it was not just her scalp that had been stripped bare today. It was the illusion that any title, any achievement, any shield of respectability could protect her skin from being seen as a threat. Reaching the landing, Naomi paused before the heavy oak doors leading to courtroom 3. Inside, a high-profile misconduct hearing was already gathering attention. Reporters, family members, civic activists, all waiting. The press had been salivating for weeks over this case. Officers accused of brutality during last year's protest downtown. The city held its breath, hungry for either redemption or collapse. Naomi was scheduled to enter through the private judge's chambers, don the robe in privacy, step out polished and composed like always. But that plan no longer mattered. Plans were for mornings that began with dignity intact. This was war now, and wars did not wait for ceremony. She reached for the door handles with both hands, feeling the cool metal bite into her palms, and pushed. The heavy doors swung open, their hinges groaning under the weight of history shifting. Instantly, the room fell silent. Conversations died mid-word. Pens froze above notepads. Cameras clicked and then hesitated, unsure whether to capture what they were seeing. Naomi Carter walked down the center aisle, the hem of her navy slacks brushing softly against the marble floor. Her scalp, raw and exposed under the fluorescent lights, gleamed like a battle scar. She carried no shame, only certainty. Rows of eyes followed her wide, confused, dawning with slow horror as realization settled like dust on polished shoes. Whispers rippled from the gallery. Is that she's, oh my God, at the defense table? One of the attorneys dropped his pen with a sharp clatter that echoed like a gunshot. Naomi did not flinch. At the side of the room, posted stiffly near the exit, Officer Monroe stood frozen, color drained from his face, pooling somewhere at the floorboards. His hands, once so quick to grab and violate, now hung limp and useless at his sides. He knew. He understood now. Too late. What he had done. Naomi's steps did not quicken. She gave him no acknowledgement, not even a flicker of contempt, because Monroe did not deserve her anger. He deserved her silence. And silence, wielded right, was the sharpest blade. At the front of the courtroom, the judge's bench waited, an empty chair, a neatly folded robe, a symbol of the authority they had thought they could erase with buzzing clippers and cruel laughter. Naomi ascended the steps without hesitation. She paused once at the bench, reaching down to lift the black robe from where it lay draped over the armrest. No clerk rushed to assist her. No bailiff offered a hand. She did not need them. She draped the robe over her shoulders herself, one slow, deliberate movement at a time, a coronation of her own making. The fabric fell heavy and familiar against her skin, swallowing the wounds they had tried to carve into her. She adjusted the collar, straightened her spine, and turned to face the courtroom. No one moved. No one dared. The power in the room had shifted, tectonic and irreversible. Judge Naomi Carter surveyed the gallery with eyes clear and unflinching. She was not just the law today. She was the reckoning. And this courtroom, this temple of paper-thin justice, was about to remember who it truly served. She nodded once to the trembling court clerk. "Is the docket ready?" she asked, voice cutting clean through the thick, heavy silence. The clerk swallowed visibly before squeaking out, "Yes, Your Honor." Naomi gave a slight nod. "Then let us begin," she said, and with those 4 words, the ground beneath them all began to crack. The courtroom buzzed under a fragile veneer of order. Whispers filled the cracks of silence like water slipping through a broken dam. Lawyers straightened their ties, shuffled their papers with trembling fingers. Reporters scribbled furiously into notepads, their faces pale and alert. Even the defendant's uniformed officers seated stiffly at the defense table shifted uneasily, the starched fabric of their dress blues rasping with every nervous movement. But the one who could not move, the one who would not move, was Officer Travis Monroe. He stood near the side door, shoulders rigid, skin drained of color. He looked like a man who had just seen the ghost of every sin he had ever committed. Naomi Carter did not look at him. She did not need to. Her very presence was judgment enough. Seated high on the bench, the black robe settled around her like a storm cloud. Naomi called the first case to order. Her voice was steady, measured, deceptively calm. This hearing was not about Monroe, not yet. Today's docket was about the officers involved in last year's protest, crackdowns, an incident that had rocked the city, sent shockwaves through news outlets, and forced a federal investigation into systemic abuse. Irony dripped from the air like sweat. Those who had mocked her that morning, who had laughed as her hair hit the floor, now stood trembling before her. Defendants in a case about unchecked authority and the crushing of civil rights. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her hands folding neatly on the polished wood of her desk. "Counselors," she said, her tone clipped and precise, "we will proceed with opening arguments." The prosecutor, a middle-aged Latina woman named Andrea Morales, rose from her seat, her voice shaking only slightly as she addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, "the government will show that these officers Jennings, Roberts, and Tate knowingly and unlawfully used excessive force against peaceful demonstrators exercising their First Amendment rights." Naomi listened without blinking, absorbing every word. She remembered that protest. She remembered the images flashing across television screens, bodies crumpled under shields, elderly men knocked to the pavement, teenagers dragged screaming into police vans. Back then, she had sat in her living room, fists clenched, jaw locked, wondering if justice would ever crack the walls built around men like Travis Monroe. Now, here she sat, the architect of the reckoning. The defense counsel stood next, a wiry man with a clipped New England accent and a polished, defensive posture. He spoke of chaos, of fear, of reasonable reactions in the heat of a fluid situation. Naomi let him speak. She let him pile excuse upon excuse, each word stacking higher like dry tinder, waiting for a spark, because patience was power. And she had mastered the art of letting men talk themselves into ruin, out of the corner of her eye. Naomi caught the smallest movement, Monroe shifting, sweating, his fingers twitching against his duty belt, like a soldier waiting for a command that would never come. He was not on trial today, but Naomi could see the wheels spinning behind his glazed stare. He thought he was safe. He thought if he stayed quiet enough, small enough, invisible enough, he could slip by unnoticed. Just another shadow in a crumbling system. But Naomi Carter had learned the cost of invisibility, and today, she would make sure that cost was paid. The defense finished their statement with a weak, half-hearted plea for understanding. Naomi nodded once, her face an unreadable mask. "We will now hear witness testimony," she said. Her gavel struck the desk once, clean and sharp. The bailiff, a different officer this time, one who still had some semblance of professionalism, called the first witness. As the witness took the stand, Naomi let her gaze sweep the room. She did not seek sympathy. She did not seek revenge. She sought balance. There was a sacredness to the law, bruised and battered though it was. And today, in this courtroom, under these broken fluorescent lights, she would breathe life back into it with the sheer force of her will. The first witness, a young black woman named Jordan Ellis, sat down nervously, her hands wringing in her lap. Naomi softened her expression just slightly, a signal. "You are safe here." Jordan's voice cracked at first but grew stronger with each sentence. She spoke of peaceful chants, of hands raised high, of sudden violence unleashed like a storm without warning. Her words painted the air with grief and fire. Naomi listened, and she remembered. Because power, real power, was not in the badge or the robe. It was in the truth spoken without fear. And today, Naomi Carter was not just the judge. She was the witness too. Witness to pain, witness to survival. And soon enough, witness to the first crack spreading under Officer Monroe's feet. Jordan Ellis's voice grew stronger as she recounted every moment of that brutal day. The air in the courtroom thickened with each word. The defense shifted uncomfortably, their polite masks slipping under the weight of her truth. Naomi Carter sat silent on the bench, her hands steepled in front of her lips, her gaze steady as stone. She was not just judging the officers on trial. She was measuring every soul in that room. When Jordan finished her testimony, she wiped at her eyes quickly, embarrassed by her own tears. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "Thank you, Miss Ellis," she said, voice low but powerful. "Your courage is noted." Jordan nodded, shoulders sagging with a mixture of exhaustion and relief as she stepped down. The prosecutor moved smoothly to call the next witness. Naomi allowed herself a brief glance toward Officer Monroe. He was sweating visibly now, a damp sheen coating his forehead. He rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes darting to the exits, to the floor, anywhere but toward the bench. He knew every word spoken in that courtroom about brutality, about injustice, was another stone placed onto his back. He could feel the weight building, and Naomi Carter was not about to lift it off. The next witness took the stand, an elderly man with a stooped back and a deep, rumbling voice. He spoke of being knocked down by officers in riot gear, of bleeding on the pavement while people screamed around him. His words were not loud. They did not need to be. Pain like that carried its own volume. Naomi listened without blinking. She remembered the old anger that had flared up the first time she saw the footage of that protest on television. The disbelief that men who had sworn to serve and protect could treat human life like so much garbage to be cleared from the streets. And she remembered the deeper anger that came afterward when the reports came in soft and sanitized, when the blame was shifted onto the very people who had been brutalized. A familiar game, a deadly one. And Naomi Carter had spent her life learning the rules so she could burn them to the ground. As the witness finished, Naomi turned to the defense counsel. "You may cross-examine," she said, her tone cool and almost bored. The defense lawyer rose, smoothing his expensive jacket, trying to shake the discomfort from his limbs. But the room was against him now. The truth hung too heavy, too real. No amount of polished rhetoric could cover the bloodstains left by careless cruelty. Naomi watched him struggle through his questions, watched the jury shift in their seats. Uncomfortable and wary, she let it unfold, because sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was to let the guilty reveal themselves. Across the room, Monroe shifted again. He was unraveling, and Naomi was just getting started. After the defense stumbled through a few more half-hearted objections, Naomi called for a short recess. The gavel cracked against the bench once more, not loud, but final. As the courtroom began to empty, Monroe made a move. He stepped toward the bench, hesitation pulling at every step like quicksand. Naomi stayed seated. She watched him approach with the calm detachment of a surgeon preparing for an operation. He stopped several feet from the bench, his eyes wide, his mouth working silently like a man drowning in words he could not form. "Your Honor," he finally croaked. Naomi arched one eyebrow slightly, inviting him to continue. Monroe swallowed hard. I just want to apologize," he stammered. "For earlier." Naomi tilted her head, studying him the way a hawk studies a wounded rabbit. "Earlier," she repeated, her voice low and dangerous. "Would you like to clarify?" Officer Monroe's hands twisted nervously at his sides. He glanced around, but there was no one here to save him, no supervisor, no fellow guards, just Naomi Carter and the empty, echoing truth. "I didn't mean," he mumbled, trailing off into silence. Naomi rose slowly from the bench. The movement was subtle but shifted the gravity of the entire room. She descended the steps with unhurried grace, every inch of her posture screaming authority Monroe could never touch. She stopped a few feet in front of him, close enough that he could see the jagged edges where her silver hair had been torn away, close enough that he could feel the cold fire radiating off her skin. "You didn't mean," she repeated, her voice slicing through the air. "To violate a federal judge, to strip a woman of her dignity, to assault without cause." Monroe shrank under her gaze. He stuttered. "I didn't know." Naomi smiled then. "A slow, terrible thing. Not cruel, just inevitable." "That," she said, "is exactly the problem." She did not raise her voice. She did not have to, because her presence, her pain, her survival, all of it spoke louder than any words could. And without another glance, Naomi turned and walked away, her robe billowing behind her like a living thing. Monroe stood rooted to the floor, the full weight of his choices crashing down on him at last. And Naomi Carter. She did not look back, not because she forgave him, but because he was no longer worthy of being seen. The courtroom slowly refilled after the recess. Chairs scraped against the marble floor as the lawyers and spectators shuffled back to their seats. The buzz of whispered speculation hung thick in the air, but it fell silent the moment Naomi Carter returned to the bench. She moved like a storm held together by sheer will, calm on the surface, lightning just beneath. Officer Monroe had retreated to a far corner of the room, his back stiff against the wall, trying desperately to vanish. But Naomi did not spare him even a flicker of attention now. He had already been judged not by words, not by rulings, but by the silence she wielded with lethal precision. The court clerk rose, calling the next case number. The defendant's officers, Jennings, Roberts, and Tate, shifted in their seats, their faces drawn and tight. Their lawyer muttered under his breath, flipping through his notes as if somewhere between the pages he might find a way out. Naomi let the weight of the room settle once more. No rush. Justice did not tremble. Justice waited. The prosecutor called her next witness, Marcus Bell, a young black man in his early 20s. He walked stiffly to the stand, his limp a silent testimony to wounds that still had not fully healed. He raised his right hand to swear the oath, his voice steady despite the visible scar running down the side of his jaw. Naomi watched him carefully, her heart tightening. This was not just another name on a docket. This was the cost of looking the other way. Marcus told his story with a quiet dignity that made the courtroom lean forward to catch every word. How he had stood at the protest, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Am I next?" How he had been pushed, slammed to the ground, the weight of armored bodies crushing the air from his lungs. How he had woken up in a hospital bed with broken ribs and a permanent limp. His testimony painted the truth in colors too vivid to deny. There had been no threat, no justification, only rage. Only power, used like a hammer against those too vulnerable to strike back. When Marcus finished, the prosecutor nodded in solemn thanks and turned toward the bench. No further questions. "Your Honor," Naomi inclined her head slightly. She turned to the defense. "Cross-examine." she commanded. The defense attorney rose. Clearing his throat awkwardly, he tried to poke holes, tried to suggest confusion, fear, mistaken identity, but Marcus remained unshaken. Every answer was direct, every detail unflinching. The truth had rooted itself deep inside him, and no desperate lawyer could pull it loose. Naomi allowed the defense to flail for a few minutes longer before interjecting sharply. "Counselor," she said, voice slicing clean through the posturing. "Unless you have substantive evidence to present, this line of questioning is wasting the court's time." The defense attorney swallowed hard and nodded. "No further questions." "Your Honor," Naomi nodded once. "You may step down." "Mr. Bell," she said. Marcus left the stand with the same dignity he had carried when he arrived. As he passed Naomi's bench, he met her gaze for the briefest second. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Respect, acknowledgement, a quiet promise that the story would not end here. Naomi tapped her gavel once, signaling the end of the witness portion for the day. "The court is adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., she announced. People began to rise, gathering their things, the room slowly dissolving into low murmurs and hurried footsteps. Naomi remained seated, watching Monroe try to disappear into the tide of exiting bodies, watching the defendants slump in their chairs, the walls of their arrogance crumbling inch by inch. Only when the last of the spectators had filed out did Naomi stand. The courtroom was empty now except for her, the clerk, and a handful of junior staff. The silence wrapped around her like an old friend. She stepped down from the bench slowly, each footfall echoing across the marble floor. At the far end of the room, Officer Monroe hovered near the exit, as if unsure whether he was allowed to leave. Naomi walked toward him, her steps unhurried, her expression unreadable. He stiffened as she approached, his hand fluttering to the radio clipped at his belt, then dropping uselessly. Naomi stopped a few feet away, tilting her head slightly. "You made a choice this morning," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. Monroe swallowed hard, unable to meet her gaze. "You chose to see a threat where there was none." He said nothing. "You chose to wield power without accountability." Still nothing. "And now," Naomi continued, "you will live with the consequences of that choice." She did not raise her voice. There was no need. The truth, spoken plainly, carried its own gravity. Monroe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Naomi gave a small nod, almost a gesture of pity. Then she turned her back on him and walked away, her footsteps echoing like drum beats of judgment across the empty hall. Justice was slow. Justice was patient. But justice, real justice, always found its mark. And Naomi Carter was done being anyone's target. She had become the storm. The next morning, the courthouse loomed even heavier against the bruised gray sky. Thunder rumbled low somewhere in the distance as Naomi Carter stepped from her car, her simple black heels striking puddles left by the early rain. She moved with the same steady grace as the day before, but inside, she was sharper, tighter. Today would not be quiet. Today, the world would see. The foyer of the courthouse buzzed with unusual energy. Reporters clustered near the metal detectors, clutching cameras and microphones. Their whispers filled the air like static. They weren't here for the misconduct trial anymore. They were here for her. The picture had leaked overnight, a blurry cell phone shot of Naomi hair butchered, face impassive, standing at the center of courtroom 3, robe slipping over her raw, shaved scalp like a banner of defiance. Someone had snapped it. Someone had shared it. And the internet had done what the internet always did, swallowed it whole, and spit it back out 10,000 times louder. Judge Carter, dignity's power, shaved, button broken. The hashtags had trended by midnight. The courthouse PR team scrambled. The chief judge called an emergency meeting, Local news vans circled like vultures around a carcass. But Naomi, she did not run. She did not hide. She pushed through the heavy double doors, her robe folded neatly over one arm, her scalp gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Every eye turned. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Security officers stiffened. Lawyers nudged one another, whispering furiously behind tight smiles. Naomi ignored them all. She moved through the crowd like a blade through fog clean, unstoppable. At the security checkpoint, Officer Travis Monroe stood waiting. His posture was different today. No arrogance, no swagger, just a brittle, hunched stillness. He did not meet her gaze as she approached. He did not ask for her ID. He did not say a word. Naomi passed through the metal detector without a sound. The machine beeped for someone else, someone behind her. But Naomi did not break stride. She had already set off alarms no scanner could catch. Inside the main hall, the marble floor shone slick under the bright lights. Court employees huddled in small groups, pretending to study their phones, stealing glances over the screens. Naomi knew what they were thinking. They had laughed yesterday. Some of them had turned their heads, biting back snickers as her hair rained down around her. Some had simply looked away, pretending not to see. Silence was its own cruelty. But today they watched her walk tall. Today they watched her shine without a crown, without armor, without even the shield of anonymity. And it scared them. Because dignity, true dignity, could not be shaved away. It could not be humiliated into silence. It only grew sharper when wounded. Naomi reached the elevators at the end of the hall. The doors slid open with a soft chime. She stepped inside alone. As the doors closed, she caught a final glimpse of Monroe still standing by the checkpoint, frozen in place like a monument to shame. The ride up to the third floor was silent. No music, no small talk, just the steady mechanical hum of rising. When the elevator doors slid open again, Naomi stepped out into a sea of faces. Third floor was busier today, packed with reporters, law clerks, even a few city officials hovering like anxious bees. She felt their eyes follow her as she walked the long corridor to courtroom 3. No one dared approach. No one dared speak. The silence was louder than any insult. Outside courtroom 3, a knot of defense attorneys whispered among themselves. When Naomi passed, they fell silent, staring at the polished tips of their shoes. She smiled inwardly. Let them look. Let them see what endurance carved into the soul looked like. Reaching the doors to the courtroom, Naomi paused. She adjusted the collar of her blouse, shifted the weight of the robe folded over her arm. Then, with a slow breath, she pushed the doors open. The room inside was already buzzing. Reporters filled the press box, their lenses glinting like hungry eyes. The public benches overflowed with spectators, some curious, some furious, all electric with anticipation. The defendants sat at the front, their lawyers whispering urgently. The gallery rippled with murmurs as Naomi entered. But she moved straight to the bench, her steps measured, her expression carved from stone. Without fanfare, she climbed the steps, unfolded her robe, and slid it over her shoulders. The robe settled around her like a second skin soft, heavy, eternal. She adjusted it once, tugging the sleeves into place. Then she sat, high above the crowded room. Naomi Carter surveyed the sea of faces. She felt the burn of their stares against her exposed scalp. She felt the weight of their judgment, their pity, their anger, and she met it all with the same unbroken stillness that had carried her through every storm. She tapped her gavel lightly against the desk. "Good morning," she said, her voice cutting clean across the room. Silence fell, real silence, not the awkward kind, the heavy, reverent kind, the kind that said everyone here knew exactly who held the power now. Naomi let the moment stretch just a heartbeat longer. Then she smiled. A small, dangerous smile. The storm had arrived, and she was the eye of it. Naomi Carter sat tall behind the bench, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood, the black robe pooling around her like a silent river. The courtroom shifted uneasily under her gaze. The defendants fidgeted at their table, their lawyers whispering frantic strategies that even now sounded hollow against the weight of the truth. Spectators filled every bench, their faces caught between pity, awe, and something colder. Fear. Fear of what happens when the person they tried to humiliate refuses to break. The clerk rose, voice cracking slightly as he announced the proceedings. All rise for the Honorable Judge Naomi Carter. The entire room stood as one, a sea of bodies compelled upward by the gravity of the moment. For a second, Naomi let the silence stretch. She let them feel it. The humiliation they had intended for her had twisted into something else, something bigger, heavier, and absolutely beyond their control. With a measured nod, she motioned for the court to sit. The sound of dozens of bodies settling onto the wooden benches filled the space. But nobody relaxed. Not today. Naomi leaned forward, steepling her fingers. Before we proceed, she said, her voice slicing clean through the tension, this court will address an incident that occurred within these walls yesterday morning. Heads snapped upward, eyes widened. This was not on the schedule. This was not part of the plan. Good. Plans were for people who still believed they controlled the story. Naomi continued. An incident took place involving misconduct by members of this courthouse's own security staff. She said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which made every word hit even harder. There was an unlawful detention, she said, an unlawful search. She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in, and an act of physical violation carried out without cause or consent. Murmurs rippled through the room. Naomi let them. She wanted them to hear it. She wanted them to remember. The defense attorney rose slowly, clearing his throat. Your Honor, if I may, Naomi cut him off with a glance. You may not, she said. He sat back down without another word. The clerk glanced nervously at Naomi, unsure where this was headed. Even the court reporter looked up from her keyboard, fingers hovering over the keys. Naomi turned her gaze toward the security officers standing along the walls. Not all had participated in what happened yesterday, but none had stopped it. None had spoken up. That silence tied them all to the crime. Effective immediately, Naomi said, a formal investigation into courthouse security practices has been opened under federal oversight. The words crashed into the room like thunder. Some officers stiffened, others looked away. Monroe, tucked near the back, looked like he wanted to crawl out of his own skin. Naomi did not look at him. He was no longer important. He was no longer the point. She turned her attention back to the courtroom at large. This court will not be a place where power is abused, she said, her voice rising slightly now. This court will not be a place where dignity is stripped without consequence. Another pause. Then she leaned back slightly, the faintest smile playing at the edges of her mouth. And if anyone doubts that, she said, they are welcome to test me. A deep, shuddering silence blanketed the room. For the first time since yesterday, Naomi felt something shift. The stares she received now were different. Not pity, not ridicule. Respect, earned not by shouting, not by demanding, but by standing, by refusing to bow. Naomi tapped her gavel once. Let us proceed with the hearing, she said. The prosecutor rose, calling the next witness. Testimony resumed, and the courtroom slowly remembered how to breathe, but the balance had changed. Every question, every answer, every objection carried the subtle tension of people navigating a new reality. A reality where Naomi Carter had rewritten the rules of engagement. Throughout the proceedings, Naomi remained poised. She listened intently. She ruled with fairness and precision. But beneath the calm exterior, something stronger pulsed, a current of righteous defiance that everyone in that courtroom could feel, even if they could not name it. Hours passed. Witnesses came and went. Arguments rose and fell. But through it all, Naomi sat immovable. The mountain they could no longer scale, the mirror they could no longer shatter. As the afternoon light slanted through the high windows, gilding the room in tired gold, Naomi finally called for recess. She rose from the bench, gathering her robe around her, and stepped down onto the main floor. The gallery parted before her like water before a prow. No one dared stand in her way. And as she walked down the center aisle, past reporters scribbling notes and attorneys whispering hurried strategies, Naomi Carter felt it settle deep in her chest. This was no longer about the humiliation they tried to force on her. This was about what happens when you refuse to be humiliated at all, because true power was not taken, it was carried, and Naomi carried it now, wrapped around her shoulders like armor, humming in her blood like a second heartbeat. The late afternoon sun threw long, tired shadows across the courthouse floors as Naomi Carter made her way back toward her chambers. Each step echoed sharp and clean against the stone, a slow drum beat that seemed to announce her presence to every hidden corner of the building. Behind her, whispers bloomed and died. No one spoke directly to her. No one dared. They watched, and that was enough. Her robe flowed behind her like a river of black silk, her shaved scalp gleaming proudly in the slanting light. It should have been a walk of shame. They had intended it to be. Instead, it had become a procession of victory, quiet, heavy, undeniable. When Naomi reached her chambers, she paused. The brass nameplate gleamed beside the door. Judge Naomi Carter, 5th District Federal Court. She rested her fingers lightly against the cool metal for a moment, letting the truth of it sink deep into her bones. They could take her hair. They could strip her of pride in a dozen small, humiliating ways. But they could not touch what mattered: the name, the title, the authority carved by years of relentless endurance. She belonged here. No matter how they twisted their faces or whispered behind closed doors, Naomi pushed the door open and entered. Inside, the room was quiet, heavy with the scent of old leather and fresh paper. The sunlight fell across her desk, illuminating stacks of case files and a neat row of law books lining the shelves. For a moment, Naomi simply stood there, breathing, letting the silence wrap around her. She shrugged off the robe, folding it carefully over the back of her chair. Her reflection caught in the glass of the office window, the shaved head, the high, proud lines of her face, the dark eyes that had seen too much and still refused to blink. She looked different, not smaller, not broken, sharper, stronger, like steel that had passed through fire and come out honed and gleaming. A soft knock at the door pulled her from the moment. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. The door creaked open to reveal her clerk, Angela, a young black woman barely a few years out of law school. Angela stood awkwardly in the doorway, clutching a stack of papers to her chest, her eyes wide and brimming with something that looked suspiciously like awe. "I have the transcripts from today, Your Honor," Angela said, stepping inside. Naomi nodded, accepting the stack. "Thank you," she said. Angela hesitated. Hovering near the desk, Naomi looked up. Was there something else? Angela bit her lip, then seemed to gather her courage. "I just wanted to say," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "that what you did today, standing there, not hiding, not apologizing, it meant something." Naomi's throat tightened unexpectedly. She set the papers down carefully, folding her hands together atop them. "Angela," she said, keeping her voice low and even, "there will always be those who try to make you small, who will tell you through words or silence or cruelty that you do not belong." Angela nodded, blinking fast. But you do, Naomi said. You always have. The young woman straightened slightly, a new steel settling into her spine. Thank you, Your Honor, she whispered. Naomi offered a small smile, the kind that cost nothing but meant everything. Now, Naomi said briskly, let's make sure every word spoken in that courtroom today is properly recorded. The truth deserves a permanent record. Angela nodded and hurried out, the door clicking shut behind her. Left alone again, Naomi sank into her chair, the leather creaking softly under her weight. She allowed herself a long, slow breath. Outside her window, the city sprawled in every direction, messy, loud, vibrant, and full of stories that would never make the headlines. Some days, the weight of those stories felt unbearable. Today, it felt lighter somehow, because today, she had added her own chapter, not by shouting, not by fighting, but by standing, by surviving, by refusing to let them decide the ending for her. Her fingers drummed lightly against the desktop, a rhythm, a heartbeat. In the silence of her office, Naomi Carter smiled to herself. They had tried to humiliate her. They had tried to break her. And instead, they had built her into something they could no longer touch. Outside, thunder rumbled low again across the distant hills. A promise, a warning. The storm was still coming. But Naomi Carter was ready. She had always been ready, and now the whole world would see it too. The next blow did not come in a courtroom. It came in the quiet, vicious world beyond it, where whispers traveled faster than bullets and reputations could be carved apart with invisible knives. Naomi Carter sat at her desk late that night, reviewing case files under the sterile glow of her office lamp. When the first email arrived, anonymous, no subject line, just a single sentence in the body. You think you're untouchable? We'll see. She stared at it for a long moment, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. The words were crude, juvenile, but the malice behind them was sharp as broken glass. She deleted it without replying. But another came, and another, each one nastier than the last. Photoshopped images of her bald head splattered across cheap, amateur memes, mock court orders declaring her unfit to serve, fake news articles accusing her of bias, corruption, even criminal activity, lies. All of them. But Naomi knew better than anyone the truth did not always matter in the court of public opinion. Perception could be a weapon, and someone had just drawn it against her. She closed the laptop slowly, her heart hammering hard against her ribs. This was not random. This was not organic. Someone or someones were orchestrating a campaign to break her in ways humiliation alone had failed. To smear her name, to undermine her authority, to strip her robe from her shoulders, not with clippers this time, but with rumors and poisoned whispers. Naomi leaned back in her chair, staring up at the ceiling. The fight was no longer just about dignity, it was about survival. The next morning, it hit harder. News outlets, the same ones who had praised her composure just a day earlier, began hinting at controversies surrounding Judge Carter. Nothing concrete, nothing they could be sued for, just enough to plant seeds, just enough to make people wonder. The courthouse buzzed with a new kind of energy as Naomi arrived for another day of hearings, an energy she knew all too well. Doubt, fear, cowardice disguised as concern. Angela, her clerk, met her at the elevator, her face pale. Your Honor, she said quietly. There's something you should know, Naomi nodded, already bracing herself. Angela led her down a side corridor, away from the main flow of staff and attorneys. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling slightly, and showed Naomi the screen. It was a post-viral now featuring an old, heavily doctored photograph. Naomi at a protest years ago, back when she was still in law school, holding a sign, marching for civil rights. The caption blared in bold, accusatory letters. Can this radical activist really be trusted to serve justice? Thousands of shares, thousands of comments, some supportive, most not. Naomi handed the phone back without a word. Angela hesitated, eyes wide and wet. I'm so sorry, Judge, she whispered. Naomi placed a steady hand on her shoulder. Do not apologize, she said. They want us to be afraid. That's the point. Angela nodded, swallowing hard. But it's everywhere. She said, even some of the attorneys are talking about filing motions to have you recused. Naomi smiled, a small, grim curve of her lips. Let them? Angela looked confused. Naomi's smile widened just a fraction. If they believe lies whispered in the dark, she said, they were never standing in the light to begin with. Angela let out a shaky breath, some of the fear draining from her eyes. Naomi gave her shoulder a final, reassuring squeeze. Go, she said. Get ready for court. Left alone in the hallway, Naomi allowed herself a moment of stillness. The attacks would not stop. They would escalate because humiliation had failed, because silence had failed. And when cruelty failed to destroy you, fear was always their next weapon. But Naomi Carter was not afraid, not anymore. They had shaved her head. They had tried to strip her dignity. They had thrown lies into the wind, hoping to bury her under them. And she was still here, still standing, still the storm. At that moment, the courthouse intercom crackled overhead, announcing the start of the day's hearings. Naomi smoothed the front of her robe, lifted her chin, and stepped forward, not toward safety, not toward comfort, but toward the fire, because sometimes the only way to defeat a lie was to stare it down with the full, unbroken truth. And Naomi Carter had never been more ready to do exactly that. The courtroom felt different that morning, not louder, not angrier, just heavier, like every breath had to push through an invisible wall of doubt and whispered accusations. Naomi Carter entered through the judge's private entrance, her black robe flowing behind her, her step steady as always. But even she could feel it, the eyes that lingered a fraction too long, the murmurs that died too quickly when she passed. She stepped up to the bench and sat. The clerk rose on cue, voice slightly thinner than usual. All rise for the Honorable Judge Naomi Carter. The room stood, but it did not feel the same. Respect, once automatic, now carried the sour aftertaste of suspicion. Naomi tapped the gavel once. You may be seated, she said. The benches creaked as bodies settled back into place. Naomi scanned the courtroom, her face neutral, her mind razor sharp. The defense attorneys whispered among themselves, casting glances her way when they thought she wasn't looking. The defendants' officers, Jennings, Roberts, and Tate sat stiffly, smirking just a little too openly now. They had heard the rumors. They thought they smelled blood in the water. Naomi felt no fear, just a slow, simmering certainty. Let them think she was wounded. Let them think they had the upper hand. The mistake they always made was confusing kindness for weakness. The prosecutor rose, moving to call the next witness, a forensic specialist who would detail the timeline of injuries inflicted during the protest. But before she could speak, one of the defense attorneys shot to his feet. Your Honor, he said loudly, his voice carrying too much eagerness. Before we proceed, the defense would like to address a matter regarding the impartiality of this court. The words dropped like stones into a still pond. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. Naomi stared at him, expression unreadable. Proceed, she said coolly. The attorney cleared his throat, adjusting his tie unnecessarily. It has come to our attention, he said, pretending at solemnity, that Judge Carter has a history of activism, particularly related to civil rights protests. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. Naomi sat perfectly still, The defense lawyer pressed on, emboldened. In light of these facts, he said, "We respectfully move for Your Honor to recuse herself from these proceedings due to potential bias." He finished with a tight smile, clearly expecting applause. Naomi let the silence stretch just long enough to make him sweat. Then she spoke. "Counselor," she said, her voice calm as polished steel, "are you referring to the photograph circulated online yesterday?" The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, Your Honor," Naomi nodded slowly. "And are you suggesting," she continued, her tone sharp enough to cut paper, "that participation in lawful, peaceful advocacy for constitutional rights disqualifies a judge from overseeing cases involving the abuse of those very rights?" The lawyer's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She pressed harder. "Are you suggesting," she said, her voice rising just slightly, "that exercising a constitutional right somehow renders a person incapable of upholding the law?" The gallery was dead silent now. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "If so," she said, "I suggest you review the First Amendment. I suggest you review every oath taken by every judge, every prosecutor, every public servant sworn to protect those rights." She let the word settle, solid, inevitable. Then she leaned back, her voice dropping to a colder register. "Motion for recusal is denied," she said, tapping the gavel once. The crack echoed off the walls. The defense lawyer sat down heavily, face flushed. Naomi turned to the prosecutor. "You may proceed," she said simply. The prosecutor, regaining her composure, called her next witness. The forensic specialist testified in steady detail about blunt force injuries. Timelines, evidence photographs. Naomi listened, asking precise questions when necessary, guiding the hearing with a firm, impartial hand. But beneath it all, she felt it, the shift. The line had been crossed. What had started as humiliation had evolved. Now it was a full attack, character assassination, professional sabotage. They would not stop at whispers. They would not stop at false images. They would try to unseat her. They would try to silence her. Naomi tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notepad as the testimony continued. She knew what was coming. The battle would leave the courtroom soon. It would spill into the public, into formal complaints, into petitions and news cycles. They would try to strip away the respect she had fought her whole life to earn. But they had forgotten something vital. She was not standing alone. Every person who had been silenced, every voice choked by injustice, every life bulldozed by cruelty and power, they stood with her now, in the walls of this courtroom, in the concrete beneath her feet, in the silent, gathering storm behind her eyes. Naomi Carter adjusted her robe slightly and sat taller. Let them come. She was not afraid of storms. She had been born in one, and she had learned to walk straight through the lightning. By the end of the day, the courthouse was a cauldron on the verge of boiling over. Naomi Carter stood at her office window, watching the gathering crowd outside. News vans lined the curbs like vultures circling wounded prey. Protesters, both for and against her, waved signs, their chants rising in chaotic waves that bounced off the old stone walls. She could hear them even through the thick glass. Stand with Carter justice for all, remove biased judges. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, letting the noise wash over her. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted her to break. Instead, she would give them silence. Powerful, measured silence. A soft knock sounded at the door. Angela peeked inside, her face tight with worry. "Your Honor," she said, "you need to see this." Naomi turned, her heels clicking lightly against the floor. Angela handed her a printed sheet, her hands trembling slightly. Naomi scanned the page. It was an open letter circulating fast, signed by a handful of prominent attorneys and officials calling for her resignation. The accusations were thin, laughable even, biased, unprofessional, unfit to serve, but Naomi knew how these things worked. It didn't have to be true. It just had to be loud enough. Angela's voice cracked as she spoke. They're saying, if you don't step down voluntarily, they'll push for a full investigation. Public hearings. Naomi handed the paper back calmly. Let them, she said. Angela swallowed. But the smear campaign, the media, they're painting you like a villain. Naomi finished for her. Angela nodded miserably. Naomi offered a small, tired smile. Good, she said. Angela blinked, confused. Naomi stepped closer, her voice dropping, low and fierce. They are afraid, she said, afraid that someone like me could sit so high, could wield power they can't control. She paused, letting the words sink deep. They think the robe was a gift. Naomi continued, that it can be taken back as easily as it was given. She shook her head slowly. But I did not inherit the seat. I built it. With years they will never understand, with sacrifices they will never see. Angela straightened, the flicker of fire returning to her eyes. What do you want me to do? She asked. Naomi smiled again, not tired this time. Sharp, dangerous. Prepare everything. Naomi said, because tomorrow we do not defend ourselves. Angela tilted her head. Uncertain. We stand. Naomi said simply, and we let them really try to take from us what they cannot touch. Angela nodded, squaring her shoulders, the fear melting away. Naomi turned back to the window, watching as the storm outside grew thicker, louder. She could almost taste the electricity in the air. The next morning, it began in earnest. A hastily convened emergency hearing a spectacle meant to parade her across the front pages, humiliate her until she resigned quietly. Naomi sat alone at the head of the chamber as lawyers and officials filed in, their faces tight with poorly concealed triumph. The lead investigator, a middle-aged man with the polished smile of someone long accustomed to backroom deals, approached the microphone. Judge Carter, he said, voice oozing false civility, you are here today to address concerns regarding your ability to remain impartial in the wake of recent revelations about your activist past. Naomi did not blink. She sat still, her hands folded neatly before her, her robe a silent fortress around her shoulders. The man continued, listing vague accusations, citing anonymous sources, reading from heavily edited social media posts as if they carried the weight of law. The spectators shifted, murmuring. The cameras whirred. The smell of blood was thick in the air. Naomi waited. She waited as they built their flimsy case, waited as they painted her into a corner with cheap colors and crooked brushes. And when the lead investigator finally turned to her, inviting her to respond, Naomi rose, slowly, deliberately. The room stilled. Her voice, when she spoke, was low, clear. I have nothing to apologize for. Naomi said, murmurs rippled. I marched for justice, she said. I stood for rights enshrined in our Constitution, a beat, and I will not apologize for believing that Black lives matter as much as any other. The gallery stirred, the words hitting like a hammer blow. Naomi's voice sharpened. You speak of impartiality, she said, scanning the room. Yet you sit in judgment of me not because I failed the law, but because I dared to believe the law should protect everyone equally. She took a step forward. And if you believe that disqualifies me, she said, her voice rising now, carrying like thunder, then you are not defending justice. You are defending injustice. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Naomi stood at the center of it, a woman stripped bare, scarred, targeted and utterly unbreakably whole. They had crossed the line. They had thrown everything they had at her, and she was still here, still standing, still the storm. The courthouse hummed with the low, nervous energy of a town waiting for a storm to break. After Naomi Carter's words, the hearing room had emptied slowly, thick with the smell of scorched pride and uneasy silence. But the real shift had not happened inside those walls. It had happened outside in the streets, in the newsrooms, in the homes of people who had watched a black woman stand alone against a machine built to grind her down and refuse to fall. And somewhere out there, the shadow that had watched Naomi's fall and rise finally stirred. That night, Naomi sat alone in her chambers. The glow of the desk lamp painting warm circles of light across the files she barely pretended to read. The attack was not over. If anything, it would get worse. She knew that. She had faced storms before. But this one was different. It was calculated, organized, designed not just to discredit her, but to erase her entirely from the landscape of authority. Her phone buzzed against the table. Unknown number. Naomi frowned but answered anyway. Judge Carter. The voice on the line said, deep and smooth. Not a question, a statement. Recognition prickled at the back of her mind. It had been years. Another life. This is Victor. The voice said, Victor Monroe. Naomi's breath caught. Victor Monroe. The man who had mentored her when no one else would. A legend in legal circles. Former federal prosecutor turned private litigator, one of the few black men who had carved his name into the marble walls of justice without apology. And when the system realized it could not break him, it simply learned to fear him. Naomi straightened in her chair. Victor, she said carefully, it's been a long time, too long. He agreed, and I wish I was calling under better circumstances. A pause. Then you're being set up. Naomi's fingers curled lightly against the edge of the desk. I know, she said. You don't know how deep it runs. Victor said, this isn't just courthouse gossip or angry officers. This is political. You're being made into an example. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. I figured, she said quietly. Victor's voice hardened. They're scared of what you represent. A black woman who won't bow. A courtroom they can't buy or bully. Naomi exhaled slowly. What do you need from me, she asked. There was a soft chuckle on the line. I'm already moving, Victor said. I have people pulling every thread, background checks, leaked memos, campaign donations. If they want war, they just found out they picked a fight with the wrong one. Naomi's lips curled into a tired smile. You always did like a good fight. I like winning better, Victor said. A pause. And you're not fighting this alone. Naomi, the words settled heavy and warm into her chest. For the first time in days, the weight on her shoulders shifted, not gone, but lighter. You'll need to hold the line. Victor continued. They'll come harder tomorrow. Maybe an emergency injunction. Maybe another motion to remove you. I can hold, Naomi said, her voice steel. I know you can, Victor said. There was a long, steady pause between them. 1,000 unspoken words packed into the silence. Pride, respect, solidarity. We're coming, Victor said finally. You'll see them. You'll see us. Then the line went dead. Naomi sat for a long time in the warm circle of her desk lamp, staring at the silent phone. The shadow had woken. Not a shadow of fear, a shadow of power, a network built in the margins. In the cracks where the light of so-called justice never reached, lawyers, advocates, journalists, organizers, people who knew what it meant to survive in a system designed to forget them, and now they were awake, and they were moving. Naomi rose from her chair, pulling the robe from its hook behind the door. She draped it over her shoulders, the weight of it familiar, grounding. Tomorrow, the storm would hit harder, but she would not stand alone on that bench. She would not face the lies alone. Behind her, the shadow would move, quiet, certain, unstoppable. Naomi Carter smiled a small, fierce thing and turned off the light. The night swallowed her whole as she stepped into it. But Naomi was no longer afraid of the dark. She had learned to walk through it with her head held high. And now, the world would learn it too. The next morning, Naomi Carter walked into the courthouse through a different kind of storm, not the quiet hostility she had felt before, not the pitying stares that clung to her skin like damp clothes. This storm was alive. It buzzed with a different energy, sharper, hungrier, louder. Supporters had gathered outside the courthouse steps, dozens, maybe hundreds, of people holding handmade signs. Some bore her name. Some simply read, "We see you. Justice wears a bald head. Carter stays." Naomi paused just beyond the glass doors, her heart thudding hard against her ribs. She had faced down officers. She had stood alone against legal machines older than the buildings that housed them. But this raw, public solidarity shook her in a different way, a deep, powerful way. Angela appeared beside her, clutching a stack of files. Her eyes were wide, filled with something close to awe. "They're here for you," she whispered. Naomi swallowed. "No," she said quietly. "They're here for all of us." Angela nodded, her hands trembling slightly from the weight of it all. Naomi smoothed the front of her robe and stepped forward, pushing through the doors into the main hall. Reporters crowded closer, but kept a wary distance. This was not a woman easily ambushed. Not anymore. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions buzzed from every direction. "Judge Carter. Will you resign, Judge Carter? Do you feel the pressure mounting against you?" Judge Carter. Any comment on the growing investigation? Naomi kept walking, her face composed, her back straight. Silence was still her sharpest sword. When she entered courtroom 3, it was already full to bursting. Reporters packed the rear benches. Attorneys whispered furiously at their tables. Defendants, the very officers accused of brutality, sat stiffly, their faces pale and uncertain for the first time. The bailiff called the court to order. But the room did not truly fall silent until Naomi ascended the bench. She sat, letting the robe settle around her like armor. She surveyed the room. No fear, no apology, just a steady, burning presence. Before the hearing could formally begin, the lead defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. "Your Honor," he said, voice a little too loud, "we renew our motion for recusal based on new information that has come to light." He gestured toward a stack of papers on the table beside him. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Proceed," she said coolly. The lawyer cleared his throat. "We have compiled additional evidence suggesting bias. Social media posts from supporters rallying under Judge Carter's name, public statements demanding the dismissal of officers. Clearly, the public perception compromises the impartiality of these proceedings." The gallery shifted uneasily. Naomi leaned forward slightly. "Counselor," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel, "are you suggesting that because people believe in the ideals of justice, the court itself must abandon them?" The lawyer faltered. "I know, Your Honor," but Naomi pressed. "Are you suggesting that because the public chooses to stand against injustice, this court should step aside and allow corruption to go unchecked?" The lawyer fumbled his papers, sweat beading on his forehead. "No, Your Honor." Naomi tapped her gavel once, silencing him. "Motion for recusal is denied," she said firmly. She let her gaze sweep the room and let the record show, she continued, that the voice of the people is not the enemy of justice. It is the very reason justice must exist. A ripple of quiet approval passed through the gallery. The defense lawyer sank back into his chair, defeated. Naomi turned to the prosecutor. "You may proceed," She said, the testimony resumed, witness after witness, story after story, each one a piece of the puzzle, fitting neatly into place, and through it all, Naomi sat steady, the center of a swirling storm that could not uproot her, because the shadow behind her was no longer invisible. It had risen, in every voice raised in solidarity, in every pair of eyes watching to see if justice could truly stand tall, in every heart that refused to bow to fear. Victor Monroe sat quietly in the back of the gallery, now a dark suit, a steady gaze, a silent promise. He had kept his word. They were not alone, and neither was Naomi. As the afternoon wore on and the hearing stretched into its third day, Naomi felt the pressure mounting, but she also felt something else building beneath it. Not just survival, momentum, a wave. And she was not about to let it break without riding it straight into the heart of everything they had tried so hard to deny. By late afternoon, the courthouse no longer belonged to its old masters. It belonged to the storm, and Naomi Carter stood at its center, unmovable. The witnesses kept coming, activists, journalists, medical experts, each one stacking another brick onto the crumbling wall of lies that the defendants and their lawyers had built. Piece by piece, the truth towered higher. Undeniable now, even to those who had tried to hide behind badges and procedural excuses. But Naomi knew better than to believe the fight was over. Power never surrendered quietly. It clawed, it scraped, it made desperate, ugly moves when cornered. And sure enough, the next move came loud, public, and clumsy. The defense rose once again. Your Honor, the attorney barked, waving a thick folder of papers. We request an immediate mistrial based on new evidence of widespread prejudice against the defendants. Naomi arched an eyebrow slightly. The defense lawyer smirked. Emboldened, we have documentation. He said that the protesters supporting Your Honor have organized online campaigns to threaten, harass, and intimidate these officers outside the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the spectators. The defense dropped copies of printed screenshots onto the court clerk's desk, angry social media posts, anonymous threats, inflammatory hashtags. Naomi remained perfectly still, calm, deadly. Have any of these actions been traced directly to individuals inside this courtroom, she asked. The defense attorney faltered. No, Your Honor, but the environment answered the question. Naomi said, her voice sharp and low. The lawyer swallowed hard. No, Your Honor, he admitted. Naomi nodded once. Motion for mistrial is denied. The defense lawyer sputtered. But Naomi held up a hand. You may continue your attempts to distract this court from the facts, she said, but understand this, the desperation of your tactics speaks louder than any testimony. The gallery stirred again, not in chaos, but in quiet, growing awe. This was not the portrait of a judge broken by scandal. This was a warrior cloaked in the authority of truth. Naomi turned back to the prosecutor. You may proceed. The prosecutor, emboldened, called the next witness an independent auditor who had reviewed the police department's internal handling of protest incidents. The auditor's findings were damning. Altered reports, missing body cam footage, whistleblower statements buried under mountains of red tape. Each revelation landed like a hammer blow against the defendant's crumbling defense. Naomi absorbed it all with steady silence. The courtroom pulsed with the gravity of what was unfolding. Outside, the protest grew louder, more organized, more relentless. Naomi could hear them even through the thick walls now, a steady chant rising over and over, shaking the very foundation of the courthouse. Justice for all justice. For all. The defendants shifted in their seats, no longer smirking. Their hands trembled as they clutched their notepads, their faces pale and clammy under the harsh fluorescent lights. They had built their careers on the assumption that no one would ever hold them accountable. Now, They faced the terrifying reality of a justice system awakening from its long sleep, and Naomi Carter, bald, battered, but unbroken, was the living embodiment of that awakening. At a brief recess, Naomi stepped back into her chambers, Angela following close behind. Angela's hands were trembling again, but not from fear this time, from adrenaline. "Your Honor," she said breathlessly, "look at this." She handed Naomi a tablet screen. Across social media, a new wave was rising. Not just supportive hashtags now, organized calls for reform, petitions demanding permanent oversight of police misconduct, editorials praising Naomi's courage, her refusal to be bullied out of her seat. One headline burned brightest: "They tried to silence her. Now she speaks for all of us." Naomi scanned the article slowly. This was bigger than her now. It had become a movement. Angela wiped at her eyes quickly. "You're changing everything," she whispered. Naomi shook her head, her voice low and sure. "I'm not changing anything," she said. "I'm reminding them what was always supposed to be true." Angela nodded fiercely. There was no fear left in her now, only fire. Naomi turned back toward the courtroom doors. The recess was almost over. The battle was not done, but the tide had turned. Because the shadow was no longer just behind Naomi, it was around her, in every voice raised outside, in every witness who spoke, in every young black woman watching and realizing that survival did not have to mean silence. Naomi Carter pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders, and she stepped back into the light. The gavel cracked once, echoing like a gunshot through courtroom 3. Naomi Carter sat tall on the bench, the black robe folding neatly around her, as if stitched to her skin. Her hands rested calmly on the polished wood, but her eyes burned with a fire that no humiliation, no smear campaign, no threat could extinguish. Today was Judgment Day. The prosecutor rose, her voice firm. "Your Honor," she said. "At this time, the government moves to submit into evidence the compiled misconduct records of Officers Jennings, Roberts, and Tate." The defense scrambled to object, their voices overlapping in a desperate chorus. "Your Honor," "relevance," "Your Honor," "prejudicial," "Your Honor." "This is a witch hunt." Naomi raised her hand. The room froze. She spoke quietly, but her words cut like a blade. "Overruled." The clerk moved swiftly, entering the thick file into evidence. The screen behind the defense table flickered to life. Document after document flashed across the monitors. Internal complaints, unjustified use of force reports, footage from body cams that had somehow survived deletion, each one painting the same ugly picture: a pattern of brutality, a culture of impunity, and a system that had looked away too long. The gallery sat silent, almost reverent. As the truth unfolded, Naomi's gaze never wavered. She watched the defendants closely. Officer Jennings shifted in his seat, his mouth drawn into a hard, bitter line. Officer Roberts clenched and unclenched his fist beneath the table, sweat beading at his temple. Officer Tate stared at the floor, face pale and slack. Their arrogance had cracked. Their invincibility had shattered. Now they sat exposed, naked in their wrongdoing, under the relentless glare of justice. In Naomi, she was the storm that had ripped the roof from their shelter. The defense attempted one last desperate move. They called a character witness, a superior officer willing to vouch for the defendant's dedication to duty, a man with silver hair and polished boots, whose smile was too practiced and whose words reeked of backroom loyalty. He spoke of split-second decisions, difficult circumstances, the burden carried by law enforcement. But Naomi's face remained unreadable. When the prosecutor cross-examined, the facade crumbled. The superior officer admitted reluctantly, under pressure, that he had personally buried multiple misconduct reports to protect the department's image. A gasp broke from the gallery. The prosecutor seized the moment. "No further questions?" she said, her voice ringing with quiet triumph. The witness stumbled from the stand. Defeated, Naomi tapped her gavel again. The sound, once merely procedural, now felt like a hammer striking nails into a coffin. Outside, the chants grew louder. The tide was not just turning, it had turned. Angela appeared briefly at Naomi's side, whispering updates into her ear. The news was spreading. Major newspapers were running the full story. Civil rights organizations were calling for sweeping reforms. City officials, once silent, were scrambling to distance themselves from the defendants. The storm Naomi had endured was now battering her enemies instead, and it was glorious. The court moved toward closing arguments. The prosecutor stood first. She spoke not with anger, not with dramatics, but with the quiet certainty of someone carrying the truth. She reminded the jury and everyone listening that justice was not about protecting institutions. It was about protecting people. She painted a picture of the victims, the old man bleeding on the pavement, the teenager in handcuffs for daring to chant, the mother sobbing over her broken son, not as statistics, not collateral damage, people, human beings. And she left them with a final, cutting question. If those sworn to protect us become our greatest threat, who will have the courage to stand for what is right? Naomi watched the jury closely. She saw it in their faces, the shifting, the softening, the realization. The defense's closing argument was flat, desperate, a tired rehashing of fear and excuses. By the time they finished, even their own clients seemed to shrink away from them. Naomi gave the final jury instructions with her usual calm precision. Then she sent them to deliberate. The room emptied slowly. Heavy with unspoken truths, Naomi retreated to her chambers, her heart beating a steady, solemn rhythm. The fall had begun, not just of three crooked officers, but of an entire illusion, the idea that power without accountability could last forever. Naomi sat in the quiet, watching the light fade from the sky through the narrow window. She thought of the march she had once joined, the sign she had carried, the chants she had shouted until her voice broke. She thought of the girl she had been, afraid, hopeful, burning with the desperate need to believe the system could be better. And she thought of the woman she was now, not naive, not broken, forged. The door creaked open. Angela peeked in, her eyes wide. The jury's back. She whispered. Naomi nodded once. She stood. She smoothed her robe. And she walked back into the courtroom, ready to hear the verdict she had waited a lifetime for. The courtroom buzzed like a live wire when Naomi Carter stepped back inside. Every seat was filled. Every reporter leaned forward. Pens poised. Cameras clicking with soft mechanical urgency. The jury filed in solemnly, their faces unreadable, their steps heavy with the weight of history. Naomi climbed the bench and took her seat. She let the silence stretch just a second longer than necessary, commanding the room without speaking a word. The foreperson, a middle-aged black woman with salt and pepper hair and steady hands, stood clutching the verdict form. Naomi nodded to her. Madam Foreperson, she said, her voice ringing clear. Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? The woman nodded once, firm and certain. We have. Your Honor. The clerk stepped forward, accepting the folded paper. The sound of unfolding filled the silence like the crackling of a distant fire. The clerk read aloud, voice steady but rising with every word. In the matter of the state versus Officer Charles Jennings, on the charge of unlawful use of force, we find the defendant guilty. A gasp from the gallery. No one moved. No one even breathed. The clerk continued. In the matter of the state versus Officer Daniel Roberts, on the charge of misconduct and obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. Another crack through the room, sharper this time. The clerk read on. In the matter of the state versus Officer William Tate, on the charge of assault under color of law, we find the defendant guilty. The final words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating against the marble and oak, sinking into every pore of the building. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Naomi sat perfectly still, absorbing the moment, not gloating, not triumphant, just present, solid as the bench beneath her, heavy as the truth. The defendants sagged visibly at their table. Jennings buried his face in his hands. Robert stared blankly ahead, hollowed out. Tate shook his head slowly, as if denying the world could change so completely in a single heartbeat. Naomi glanced to the prosecutor, who gave a tight, professional nod. Justice had been done. But Naomi knew this was just the beginning. The clerk gathered the paperwork. Recording the verdicts officially, Naomi tapped the gavel once. The court thanks the jury for their service, she said, her voice low and steady. You are dismissed with the gratitude of this court. The jurors filed out, some stealing furtive glances toward Naomi, their faces quietly shining with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Outside the windows, the chant of the crowd grew louder. They knew. The news had already broken. The building itself seemed to tremble under the force of it. Naomi turned her attention back to the defendants. They still sat there, stunned and ruined. Once, they had walked these halls with swagger, with impunity. Once, they had laughed at the idea that anyone could hold them accountable. Now, they looked like what they had always been, bullies stripped of their armor, men who mistook cruelty for power. Naomi spoke clearly, without anger. Sentencing hearings will be scheduled within the next 30 days, she said. In the meantime, the defendants are remanded into custody without bail. The bailiffs moved in, the metallic clink of handcuffs echoing through the room. Jennings protested weakly, but no one listened. The gallery remained utterly silent. No applause, no cheers, just the cold, solemn satisfaction of a wrong finally set right. Naomi watched as they were led away, their heads bowed, their footsteps shuffling. It would not erase the harm they had done. Nothing could, but it was a start, a crack in the dam, a reminder that the system, battered and slow as it was, could still remember its purpose when forced to. Angela met Naomi's eyes across the courtroom, her face shining with tears she didn't bother to hide. Naomi allowed herself a small nod, not a smile. Not yet. Too much had been lost. Too much still remained to be fought for, but a promise unspoken and binding. We are not powerless. We are not invisible. We are not done. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Naomi remained seated for a moment longer, letting the gravity of what had happened settle deep into her bones. The battle had been brutal, personal, ugly, and it was far from over. But today they had won a piece of ground that would not easily be taken back. She rose from the bench, gathering her robe around her, her movements slow and deliberate. The storm still raged outside. But Naomi Carter was not afraid. She had walked through fire. She had been stripped bare. She had been dragged into the dirt. And still she stood. She walked down the center aisle of the emptying courtroom, her footsteps echoing loud against the marble floor. No fanfare, no speeches, just the quiet, relentless truth. They had tried to break her. Instead, they had forged her into something stronger than they had ever imagined. Naomi Carter pushed open the heavy courthouse doors and stepped out into the roaring storm. And for the first time in a long while, the storm roared with her. The rain had started by the time Naomi Carter stepped out onto the courthouse steps. Fat, heavy drops falling slow at first, soaking into the old stone, darkening it like bruises blooming across the ground. The crowd outside barely flinched. They lifted their signs higher. They raised their voices louder. And when Naomi appeared, the roar that went up was not wild, Not chaotic. It was steady, rhythmic, certain. Carter, Carter. Carter. The sound hit Naomi like a wave. She paused at the top of the steps, her robe fluttering around her ankles, the rain slicking across her scalp, across the sharp planes of her face. She did not raise her hands. She did not smile. She simply stood there, letting the storm wash over her, letting the people see what endurance truly looked like. Angela appeared beside her, clutching a folder against her chest to protect it from the rain. "You don't have to say anything," she said urgently. "We can go. We should go." Naomi shook her head slowly. "No," she said quietly. This was not about her ego. This was not about victory laps. It was about standing, visible, unbroken, alive. She stepped forward, down the first few steps, the crowd parting slightly at the base to give her space. A few reporters shoved microphones forward, shouting questions she barely heard. "Judge Carter, how do you respond to the verdict? Judge Carter, do you believe real change is possible? Judge Carter, what's next?" Naomi stopped halfway down the steps. The rain poured harder now, flattening the world into a blur of gray and silver. She turned slowly, facing the sea of faces, some young, some old, some black, some white, all waiting, all watching. She drew a slow breath, the kind that reached down into the center of her chest and pulled everything she was up to the surface. Then she spoke. No microphone, no podium, just her voice steady and human against the storm. "This is not about one verdict," she said, her words carrying clean through the air. "This is not about one courtroom, or one judge, or even one set of defendants." The crowd leaned closer, hanging on every word. "This is about a promise," Naomi said. "A promise that justice belongs to all of us, not just the powerful, not just the protected, all of us." The rain poured harder. She didn't blink. "They tried to strip me of dignity," she said. "They tried to silence my voice, erase my worth, grind me into dust." Her voice sharpened, each word a blade, but they forgot something. A beat. The crowd held its breath. "You cannot silence the truth," Naomi said. "You cannot erase a voice that refuses to die." A roar rose up, not wild, not chaotic, but deep and resonant, like the ground itself answering back. Naomi lifted her chin. "I am not the first to stand here," she said, "and I will not be the last." Another cheer, louder this time, vibrating through the rain-soaked air. She let it roll over her, not for glory, not for fame, but because it mattered. Because every girl with dark skin and dreams too big for small minds was watching. Because every boy told to bow his head and keep his voice low was listening. Because dignity was not something given, it was claimed, and it was defended day after day, storm after storm. Naomi stepped down the last few steps and into the heart of the crowd. They parted around her, reaching out, some with tears, some with trembling hands. She did not shy away. She moved through them, a living, breathing proof that you could survive the fire and still walk whole. Victor Monroe stood at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, a small, grim smile curving his mouth. He nodded once when their eyes met. Not congratulations, acknowledgement, respect, solidarity. Angela rushed to Naomi's side, holding out an umbrella. Naomi took it, not to shield herself from the rain, but to lift it over Angela's head instead, because survival was not just about making it through. It was about lifting others up as you went. As they walked together through the storm, Naomi Carter knew the fight was far from over. New battles would come, new lies, new betrayals, but she would meet them all the same way, head high, heart fierce, silent when needed, loud when necessary, and always, always standing, Because the fall of those who tried to crush you was never the end. It was only the beginning of your rise. And Naomi Carter was just getting started. The next few days unfolded like a dream Naomi Carter had never dared allow herself to imagine. But this was no dream. It was real. The verdict sent shockwaves across the country. Major news outlets ran her story on every front page. Editorials praised her resilience, her unflinching stand in the face of systemic rot. Communities that had long felt invisible found a rallying cry in her name. Stand with Carter trended worldwide. University professors discussed her courtroom speeches in their lectures. High school students wrote essays about her courage. Mothers whispered her name to their daughters like a prayer. Naomi watched it all unfold from a distance, never chasing the spotlight, never basking in it, but understanding the weight of what she had carried, what she had survived, and what she had passed forward. Late one evening, as twilight painted the city in bruised purples and golds, Naomi sat alone on the steps of the courthouse. The building behind her loomed heavy with history, some good, most blood-stained, but tonight it felt different, not redeemed, but awakened. Angela appeared beside her, two steaming cups of coffee in hand. Without a word, she offered one to Naomi and sat down next to her. For a long moment, they simply sipped in silence, watching the last light drain from the sky. Then Angela spoke, her voice soft. "Did you ever think it would happen like this?" Naomi smiled faintly. "I didn't think it would happen at all." Angela nodded, kicking lightly at a loose pebble with her shoe. "They're talking about making your case a study in every major law school," she said. "About judicial independence, about silent strength." Naomi raised an eyebrow, amused. "Silent strength," she repeated. "Sounds like something you'd put on a coffee mug." Angela chuckled. "But it's real," she said, more serious now. "You showed us something we forgot." Naomi turned to look at her. "Showed you what?" Angela hesitated. Then, with a shaky breath, she said, "That you can survive without becoming what tried to destroy you." The words hit harder than Naomi expected, because she knew the temptation, knew how easy it would have been to let anger hollow her out, to let bitterness replace principle, to fight fire with fire until all that remained was ash. But she hadn't, even at her lowest, humiliated, shamed, stripped. She had chosen dignity, not because it was easier, because it was necessary, because without it, survival meant nothing. Naomi looked back toward the horizon, where the last sliver of sun bled away into night. "You fight with your hands," she said quietly. "You fight with your mind." A pause. "But most of all," she continued, "you fight with who you refuse to become." Angela nodded, silent, absorbing every word. They sat there until the courthouse lights blinked on, casting the stone steps in soft golden pools. Behind them, inside those walls, change was beginning slow, painful, inevitable. Old judges whispering urgently behind closed doors, new cases being reviewed with fresh eyes, policy meetings scheduled where none had existed before. The system groaned under the pressure, like old timber straining against a rising tide. Naomi knew the work had only just begun. Real change was not a headline. It was slow, relentless, grain by grain. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself a rare, fragile hope, because dignity, once defended, spreads, because courage, once shown, does not vanish. It takes root, it grows, it finds new hands to carry it forward. Naomi finished her coffee and stood, brushing rainwater and grit from the hem of her robe. Angela rose too, tucking her empty cup into a nearby trash can. They faced the courthouse together. Two women, two generations, linked by more than blood or title, linked by choice, by endurance, by silent strength. Naomi placed a hand lightly on Angela's shoulder. Are you ready for tomorrow, she asked. Angela smiled wide. Real. Born ready, she said. Naomi nodded once, satisfied. Then they turned and walked down the courthouse steps, side by side, into the thickening night. The storm had come, the storm had passed, but its lesson remained, etched deep into stone and soul alike. True power isn't about how loud you roar. It's about how quietly you refuse to fall. The next morning, Naomi Carter stood in front of a packed auditorium at Lincoln High School. It had not been part of any official plan. There was no press release, no official statement. Just an invitation scribbled hastily on a notepad by a guidance counselor who, after seeing Naomi on the news, had whispered to herself, "Our kids need to hear her." And Naomi had said yes, not because it was glamorous, not because it was easy, but because she remembered. She remembered being 15 years old, sitting in a hard plastic chair under buzzing fluorescent lights, desperate to believe someone like her could be powerful without selling pieces of herself to survive. She owed it to them, the ones still dreaming, still doubting, still rising. The principal introduced her with shaky hands and nervous smiles. But when Naomi took the stage, everything else faded. The students sat in rows of metal chairs, some slouching, some leaning forward, some pretending not to care but sneaking glances anyway. Naomi stood behind no podium. She just stood, real, visible. Her robe left behind at the courthouse, replaced with simple dark slacks and a soft gray sweater. The scar of her shaved scalp was now barely noticeable, but Naomi wore it like a medal all the same. She cleared her throat once, the mic humming faintly. "Good morning," she said, a murmur of response. She smiled. "That's all right," she said. "You don't have to be loud." A few chuckles. Naomi stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "I'm not here to give you a lecture," she said. "I'm not here to tell you to behave or to work hard, even though those things matter." She paused, scanning the room, letting her gaze land on every face, every skeptical eye, every hopeful flicker. "I'm here to tell you that you are enough," Naomi said, voice steady, silence, the good kind, the kind that stretches because people are listening. Not when you graduate, not when you get a title, not when someone finally decides you're worthy. She shook her head slowly. "You are enough right now." A girl in the second row, tight braids, sharp eyes sat up straighter. A boy in the back, hoodie pulled low, arms crossed, tilted his head just slightly, listening despite himself. Naomi pressed forward. "They will try to tell you otherwise," she said. "They will call you angry when you demand fairness. They will call you arrogant when you refuse to bow. They will call you dangerous simply because you exist where they did not expect you to." A ripple of emotion flickered through the room. Naomi softened her voice, but her words stayed sharp. "When they do, and they will remember this, a beat. You were not made to shrink. You were not made to apologize for your strength. You were not made to survive only by hiding." She let the words sink deep. "I know it feels impossible sometimes," she continued. "I know it feels like you're pushing against something so big, so ancient, so immovable that your voice couldn't possibly matter." A few heads nodded now, a few arms uncrossed. "But it does," Naomi said fiercely. "It matters when you walk into a room and refuse to lower your gaze. It matters when you speak your truth even when your voice shakes. It matters when you survive not quietly, not shamefully, but boldly." The room was so still she could hear the rain tapping softly against the old windows. Naomi smiled, then a real smile. "Tired but fierce. You don't win every fight," she said. "You don't walk away from every battle unscarred." She touched her head lightly, a silent reference to all she had endured. "But every time you stand, every time you refuse to disappear, you leave a crack in the walls that were never built for you." A slow, soft ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, then growing. Naomi held up a hand. And one day, she said, her voice low but caring, "Those walls will fall, and when they do, it won't be because of a headline or a speech. It'll be because of all the cracks you made." Day after day, by refusing to fall, the students rose, one by one, then in waves, not because they were told, not because they were expected, but because they felt it. They understood. Naomi Carter stepped off the stage, not into glory, not into fame, but into the quiet, thundering current of real change. Because lessons are not taught by speeches alone, they are taught by survival, by dignity, by the simple, stubborn act of standing where you were never meant to stand and refusing to move. After the assembly, Naomi Carter found herself surrounded by students. They came hesitantly at first, a ripple at the edge of the crowd, but soon they surged forward in small, determined waves. Some wanted a handshake, some wanted a selfie, some just wanted to stand close enough to feel the gravity she carried. Naomi gave them all her time. A boy with nervous hands and a battered backpack pressed a crumpled piece of notebook paper into her palm. "I wrote this last night," he mumbled. "I didn't think anyone would care." Naomi unfolded it carefully, a poem, raw and fierce, scribbled in tight handwriting. She read it slowly, her heart tightening with every line. When she finished, she looked him in the eye. "I care," she said simply. The boy's face crumpled in a smile, and he darted away before his emotions could betray him. Next came a girl, her hair dyed bright blue, a heavy camera slung around her neck. "I want to be a journalist," she blurted, "but they keep telling me to pick something easier." Naomi crouched so they were eye level. "Anything worth doing," she said, "was once called impossible by someone too afraid to try." The girl beamed, clutching her camera tighter. Naomi stood, turning toward the next student, and the next, and the next, each one carrying hopes fragile and burning, like paper lanterns in a storm, each one needing to see, to truly believe that survival was not enough, that thriving, that standing proud, that reshaping the world was possible. And here Naomi stood, living proof. Later, as the crowd thinned and the auditorium emptied into the rainy afternoon, Naomi found herself alone by the back doors. Angela approached, holding 2 paper bags of takeout. "You didn't eat lunch," she said, handing one over. Naomi chuckled softly. "Neither did you." They sat together on the back steps of the school, the rain a soft mist now rather than a downpour. The city spread out before them, messy, alive, imperfect. Angela unwrapped her sandwich. "So what happens now?" she asked between bites. Naomi considered it. The courthouse awaited. New cases, new battles. The system would not fix itself overnight. Old power would not yield without a fight. But Naomi smiled anyway. Now she said, "Now we keep showing up." Angela grinned. "Sounds exhausting." Naomi laughed, a low, rich sound pulled from a place deeper than fatigue. "It is," she admitted. "But it's the only way the cracks grow wide enough to let the light in." They ate in companionable silence, the city humming around them. After a while, Angela spoke again, her voice softer. "You ever think about leaving it all behind?" she asked. "After everything they put you through." Naomi thought about it, about quiet houses by the sea, about jobs that didn't demand your soul just to be seen, about waking up without a fight waiting at the door. She thought about it and smiled sadly. "Sometimes," she said, "but then I remember." Angela looked at her, waiting. Naomi's voice dropped low. "If we all walk away," she said, "who's left to fight for the ones who can't?" Angela nodded slowly, understanding settling deep into her bones. The lesson was not about glory. It was not about revenge. It was about responsibility. about carrying forward what others had carried for you, even when it was heavy, even when it hurt, especially then, because that's when it mattered most. Naomi finished her sandwich, crumpling the paper bag neatly between her hands. The rain had stopped. The city shimmered in the silvered light, cracked sidewalks gleaming, windows blinking awake. Angela stood, stretching. "You ready to go back?" she asked. Naomi rose too, brushing crumbs from her slacks. "I was never gone," she said with a small smile. Together, they walked back toward the courthouse, toward the fight, toward the cracks, toward the stubborn, glorious work of making the impossible possible. Because the greatest lesson Naomi Carter had learned and now passed on was simple. You do not fight because you are guaranteed to win. You fight because staying silent is already losing. And every step you take, every voice you lift, every crack you make brings the walls closer to falling. The city felt different now. Not healed, no. Not yet, but awake. As Naomi Carter walked through the rain-slick streets toward her neighborhood, she felt the shift in the air, in the way people moved, in the way heads turned not out of suspicion, but out of recognition, not fame, something deeper, acknowledgement, respect. She wore no robe today, no badge clipped to her lapel, just a simple gray hoodie pulled low over her bare head. The fabric clung damp against her skin, the edges fraying slightly from too many washes. It was an old hoodie, the kind you keep not for style, but for memory. It had been her brother's once, years ago, handed down to her with a grin and a shove and a muttered, "Don't let the world take you down." She had almost forgotten it in the chaos of the courthouse storms. But today, reaching for it felt right. Because today wasn't about robes and titles. Today was about walking as herself whole, scarred, proud. She passed a mural painted onto the cracked side of a corner store. It hadn't been there before. Bright colors, bold lines, a figure standing tall against a backdrop of fists and voices and broken chains. Not her face exactly, but the spirit unmistakable. Someone had seen her. Someone had made her story a part of the city's walls. Naomi paused, heart twisting, not from sorrow, from the sheer, overwhelming reality that survival could inspire more than pity. It could inspire action. A group of teenagers skateboarded past her, laughing, shoving each other playfully. One of them, a skinny black boy with a mop of wild hair, caught sight of her. His board slowed, his eyes widened. Naomi smiled under the shadow of her hoodie. The boy didn't say anything. He just lifted his chin a tiny, defiant, beautiful salute and pushed off again, carving a clean, bright path down the broken street. Naomi's chest tightened. That was it. Not headlines, not ceremonies. Moments like that, small, unspoken, unstoppable, she kept walking. Through neighborhoods, still fighting for breath, past boarded-up storefronts tagged with spray-painted slogans, past mothers dragging groceries through puddles while balancing babies on their hips. Life, messy and stubborn, thrived here. And now, so did hope. A hope that came not from waiting to be saved, but from seeing one of their own survive the fire and still walk, head high. Naomi reached the community center at the edge of the neighborhood just as the streetlights flickered on. Inside, folding chairs had been set up in neat rows. Kids laughed and chattered, weaving between adults who tried and failed to wrangle them into order. Tonight wasn't about politics. It wasn't about policy. It was just about coming together. A town hall, organized at the last minute by neighbors who understood something had shifted and didn't want to lose the momentum. Naomi pushed back her hood as she entered. Heads turned, a ripple of smiles, nods, claps on shoulders, no grand entrance, no applause demanded, just people seeing her, welcoming her. Angela waved from near the front, her face bright with pride. Victor Monroe leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, offering her a subtle nod of acknowledgement. Naomi made her way through the crowd, stopping to shake hands, to listen, to be present. A little girl tugged at the hem of Naomi's hoodie. When Naomi crouched down, the girl whispered shyly, "You're the lady who didn't let them win." Naomi's throat tightened. She touched the girl's shoulder gently. "No, sweetheart," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "I just reminded them they couldn't." The girl beamed and skipped back to her mother, her tiny sneakers squeaking against the floor. Naomi stood slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. Not heavy, solid, real. Tonight wasn't about her standing above them. It was about standing with them, as equals, as survivors, as builders of something better. The meeting began, voices rising not in anger but in determination, plans to push for civilian review boards, plans to protect whistleblowers, plans to mentor the next generation of advocates. Real change, not promised from podiums, but hammered out on folding chairs under flickering lights. Naomi listened. She spoke when needed. Mostly, she bore witness, because sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was to show up, to take the blows and the bruises and the scars and still stand, still fight, still walk. When the meeting ended, Naomi pulled her hoodie up once more. She stepped back into the night, into the rain, into the city that had tried to break her and now hummed with the pulse of her survival. The hoodie clung to her like a second skin, a reminder, a promise. Naomi Carter walked on. And this time, the whole world walked with her. The city pulsed with quiet energy as Naomi Carter made her way through the narrow streets. Her hoodie pulled low against the misty drizzle. Each block she crossed carried memories, not grand victories, not headline moments, just small ones, gritty and real. The corner store where the old man had once been shoved to the pavement. The bus stop where teenagers had been frisked for nothing more than existing. The vacant lot that once echoed with the sounds of protest chants swallowed by the night. Naomi walked past all of it, not turning away, not forgetting, carrying it, claiming it. Her footsteps were steady, unhurried. The city had not changed overnight. The cracks still ran deep, spider webbing through courts, through council chambers, through blood and asphalt. But now, something had shifted. The cracks were not just wounds anymore. They were pathways. And Naomi Carter was walking them wide open. As she turned onto Jefferson Avenue, she saw them, a line of kids, middle schoolers, mostly standing beneath the busted streetlight, kicking at pebbles and arguing over something too trivial to matter. But when they saw her, they froze. One of them, a boy with knobby knees and a too-big jacket, broke into a grin. "Hey," he shouted, "that's her. That's the judge lady." Naomi laughed softly under her breath. Judge lady? She liked that better than any title they could pin to a wooden door. The boy jogged up to her, his friends trailing behind, each trying to act cooler than the last. "Is it true?" he asked breathlessly. "Did you really tell all those cops they couldn't touch you?" Naomi smiled, crouching down to meet his eye. "I told them," she said carefully, "that nobody gets to take your dignity unless you hand it to them." The boy frowned, working through the meaning. One of the girls, braces glinting under the streetlight, nodded sharply, like, "Even if they try to embarrass you, you still win if you don't let them." Right? Naomi's smile widened. "Exactly," she said. The kids looked at each other, wide-eyed, somewhere in their young minds. The seeds took root. Maybe survival wasn't enough. Maybe standing tall, even when they tried to crush you, was a victory all its own. Naomi straightened, ruffling the boy's hair gently. "Keep your head high," she said. "And remember," she added, "a hoodie doesn't make you dangerous." She tapped her own hood lightly. "It makes you strong." The kids whooped. bumping shoulders and laughing as they darted back toward their block. The kind of joy that came from realizing someone like them had walked through the fire and didn't come out ashes. Naomi turned back toward the main road, her heart lighter. One conversation wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. And sometimes a start was enough. The rain softened into a fine mist, clinging to the cracked pavement, catching the dim orange of the street lamps. Naomi passed a laundromat where an elderly woman folding clothes gave her a nod of approval, a diner where the cook behind the counter raised a spatula in salute, an old church where someone had scrawled in careful chalk letters across the worn steps, "We rise together." Naomi stopped for a moment, staring at the words, simple, unpolished. Perfect. This, not the verdicts, not the newspaper headlines, was a legacy she had helped carve, a legacy built from stubborn hope, from fierce tenderness, from the refusal to vanish. She pulled her hoodie tighter and kept walking, past the courthouse, its towering pillars slick with rain, past City Hall, where politicians scrambled now to ride the wave they once tried to ignore, past monuments to old power, still standing but no longer unchallenged. Naomi Carter walked through the city she had fought for, not a savior, not a symbol, a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had chosen, again and again, to stay upright when the world demanded she kneel. Ahead of her, a young girl in a red hoodie skipped along the sidewalk, a backpack bouncing against her spine. The girl caught Naomi's eye and grinned. Not a shy grin, not the nervous kind that seeks permission, a bold grin, a knowing grin. Naomi nodded, a silent greeting passing between them, two warriors separated by years, but bound by something unbreakable. The girl turned the corner and disappeared into the night, her red hoodie a bright slash against the gray. Naomi watched her go, and then, with the steady, unstoppable steps of someone who understood that every stride mattered, Naomi Carter kept walking, the hoodie walked on, and the world, cracked and stubborn and beautiful, walked with her. The night deepened, thick and heavy with the smell of wet asphalt and electric hope. Naomi Carter moved through it like a ghost stitched from iron and memory. Her hoodie clung to her, damp but warm, as familiar as her own heartbeat. Each step forward felt less like walking and more like claiming something inch by inch, breath by breath that had always been hers but had long been denied. Freedom, not the kind handed down from podiums, not the kind framed on dusty walls. The real kind, the kind you built with blistered hands and broken pride and the stubborn refusal to surrender. She turned onto 53rd Street, a quieter stretch lined with mom-and-pop shops and boarded-up storefronts painted in wild murals. Up ahead, the old library stood like a monument forgotten by time. Its bricks were chipped, its roof sagged, but its doors still opened every morning, and kids still wandered through, chasing stories bigger than the broken world outside. Naomi slowed as she approached the steps. A group of teenagers lounged on the low wall, passing a battered basketball between them. They went silent as she drew near, not hostile, not afraid, watching, measuring. The tallest of them, a lanky boy with a hoodie of his own, deep blue and fraying, at the cuffs straightened slightly. "You the judge?" he asked, his voice half challenge, half curiosity. Naomi pushed her own hood back, letting them see her fully, the shaved head, the unbowed eyes, the scarred dignity that no smear campaign could tarnish. "I am," she said simply. The boy nodded once, a small, tight movement. Respect, earned, not demanded. One of the younger kids whispered, "She the one who stood up when they tried to tear her down." Naomi smiled, not big, not showy, just enough. "I stood," she said, "and I'm still standing." The boy tossed the basketball in the air, caught it one-handed. "You gonna keep fighting?" he asked. Naomi looked at him, really looked. saw the anger curled under his words, the fear, the fragile hope he was too proud to show. "I'm not fighting alone," she said. The boy blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah," he said. Naomi stepped closer. "You think walking these streets, wearing your hoodie, carrying your dreams, you think that's not fighting?" He frowned. "You think surviving another day when they tell you you ain't supposed to, you think that's not a battle?" The boy's jaw clenched. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled his own hood up over his head, matching her, acknowledging her. Naomi nodded once, a quiet oath passing between them. The battle wasn't just fought in courtrooms or marches. It was fought here, on cracked sidewalks, under broken streetlights, in every stubborn, beautiful act of existing without apology. "Stay strong," she said. The boy grinned, flashing teeth too white and too sharp to ever be erased. "You too, Judge." Naomi turned away then, stepping back onto the empty sidewalk. Behind her, the basketball thudded softly against concrete. Life, messy and persistent. Ahead, the city sprawled wide and waiting. She thought of all the others walking their own unseen battles tonight. The janitor finishing a graveyard shift who refused to let exhaustion steal his pride. The mother counting pennies at the grocery checkout line without lowering her eyes. The teenager writing poetry by flashlight because the power was out again. But the dreams burned too bright to smother. All of them. Cracked, scarred, unbroken. Naomi Carter walked for them too. For every whispered no that became a roar. For every bowed head that lifted. For every hoodie worn without shame. A silent flag against a world that tried to erase them. The mist thickened into rain again, soft and relentless. Naomi pulled her hood back up and kept walking. She passed a bus stop where a mural had been half washed away by time and weather. Only a few letters remained, scrawled in angry red paint. "We still here." Naomi smiled. Yes, yes. They were, not hidden, not silent, still here, still fighting, still walking. At the end of the block, the city opened up into a wide plaza ringed by shattered benches and broken fountains. Tomorrow it would fill with protesters again, or preachers, or teenagers claiming the space with laughter. Tomorrow, it would become a battlefield, a classroom, a pulpit, whatever the people needed it to be. But tonight, it was quiet, and it belonged to Naomi. She stepped into the plaza, the rain hissing against the stone around her, the air humming with the heartbeat of a city refusing to surrender. She stood there, alone but never lonely, feeling the ground solid beneath her feet, the sky endless above. The hoodie moved with her, soft, defiant, alive. And as Naomi Carter turned her face toward the rain, toward the future, toward everything still left to fight for and everything already won, she smiled and she walked on. Sometimes, the strongest voice is the one that refuses to scream. Sometimes, the greatest victories are not shouted from podiums, but carried quietly in the way we walk, the way we endure, the way we refuse to be erased. Naomi Carter didn't need a title to define her worth. She didn't need a perfect stage to prove her power. All she needed was her dignity, her will, and her hoodie pulled up, not in fear, but in defiance. Her story is a reminder for every person who has ever been told they are too small, too angry, too different to matter. You matter. You belong. And when you walk with your head held high, even when the rain falls, even when the world doubts you are writing a story bigger than any hate could ever erase, silent power is still power. And the hoodie walks on. Before you go, tell us, where are you watching from? What part of Naomi's story resonated with you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you believe in silent strength, in dignity over noise, In standing tall, even when the world demands you shrink, then subscribe to Silent Power Stories. Hit the bell so you never miss a story that reminds you of your worth. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and be part of a community that chooses resilience over rage. Together, we walk. Together, we rise.